Well, here we are once again with the tenses of life. Chuck Missler, Brian Hughes here, as we sit together, as we do so often, just to talk about Chuck's life and some of those remarkable events that really defined not only Chuck's life and all, but sometimes changed an industry.
Well, they have a lesson, because sometimes the most trivial incident in a large corporation has leverage that you'd never predict. It's just strange. There was an era there where I was very close to some of the Rockwell guy. Don Beal was the head of electronics group, and there was a planning meeting on I think a Thursday or Friday. I was part of just a planning meeting, and apparently Art Collins Collins Radio was going to be into play, and so there was going to be a visit of a senior team to go visit Richardson, Texas, where in Dallas, roughly, it's a suburb of Dallas, which was the headquarters for Collins Radio. And anyway, in this planning meeting, as a surprise, the guy leading the meeting was Don Beal. He finished the meeting by letting me know, you're going to be going with us to Dallas on the weekend. And I was surprised because I didn't know I was going. It was sort of just a gesture of let me tag along on this big deal. See, so okay, great. But the important part of the story was I didn't know. That was a surprise. I didn't know I was coming. It was a last-minute kind of bouquet, so to speak. And sure enough, we fly to Richardson, Texas, and a strange thing occurred as we got off the plane. The head of McKinsey & Company, which is the worldwide management consulting firm, as we're getting off the plane, the head of McKinsey was there. I forget his name now. It'll come to me in a minute. Pulled me aside. Says, "Chuck, how did you get on this plane?" And I didn't know I was going to be on the plane. He says, "I've been working on this thing for 2 years, and now that we're getting to the closing, how did you get involved here?" I was bewildered. I didn't know I was going to be involved. But he knew he was surprised to see me there. So we get off the plane and we go into the organization. Everybody was assigned sort of a running mate to do a due diligence on Art Collins's company. And as we're going through one of the hallways, Don Beal or one of the guys came to me, as Chuck, cool it, because Art Collins is upset you're on this team. And I'm bewildered that he would know me from Adam. I didn't know I was coming. Why would he be concerned, upset that he found out that I was going to be on this review team? And I'm trying to integrate this because it's all one surprise after another. And but there was an interesting thing occurred right after that. I was going around down the hallway around the turn, and lunch had been brought in, as they often do there, during just a sandwich lunch brought in. And as they're sitting there, Art Collins is sitting, and I'm being introduced to him for the first time. And I just had this warning, of course, but there's Art Collins, and the big, tall guy, and I told him, it was a strange impulse of candor. As he stood up, I took his hand, and I says, "Art Collins, this is an event in my life because," I said, "I'm a radio ham, W6 Old Hound Dog, and I've lived under the spell of the 75A1 receiver, which is in those days, it was the dream of any amateur radio guy. That was the cream of the crop.
The Rolls Royce. Or
yeah,
whatever.
Right. And so I haven't mentioned that the fact that I mentioned I was a radio ham melted him. And we ended up, see, suddenly what happened in that instant, you have to understand the culture in those days. The technology culture was divided into two groups: computer people, communications people. And they didn't, it was an era when they were at odds with each other. Apparently the background I didn't have then, I found out later, is apparently TRW came in to look at Art Collins, and they brought in their computer consultant, which was an IBM-oriented kind of guy. One of the pet projects of Art Collins was what he called the C system. It was a very over-engineered, super system that was his pride and joy. And the TRW consultant, he disparaged Art Collins' favorite project. Art Collins threw TRW out of the deal. And so when they heard that Rockwell had brought their computer consultant, they thought it would be a repeat of the same thing, you see.
So he was already, the deck was stacked against you from the beginning.
But when I came around the corner and I turned out to be a radio ham, suddenly that was just the opposite. Willie Six, anybody that knows amateur radio knows that W6 calls implies very early, because they ran out of W6 way back. If you know the amateur radio culture, a W6 OHD meant that I had a radio ham ticket when I was at like 9, young, very young.
Yeah.
And so the fact that I was W6 OHD tagged me as a long-standing communications guy, not a computer guy. And so Art Collins was melted. We walked down the hall. He's a big, tall guy. He put his hand on my shoulder, and he's talking about his new digital tuning thing and stuff. Well, the way that gets carried back to headquarters, I found out later.
In California.
In California, is the story that got back to the headquarters was that Chuck Missler saved the Collins acquisition. Now, that whole thing got exaggerated out of proportion. And when I heard those stories, I couldn't understand, what are they talking about? And it was all an exaggeration of that moment, is that because Art Collins suddenly warmed up to us, suddenly he was among friends, and before the week was over, Art Collins and Don Beal flew to El Segundo, or was it Pittsburgh? Anyway, they had two headquarters, to pick up an $85 million check.
Which in those days was?
Big money, big money. And they knew that was not enough for Art Collins to turn around, and when he needed to pay more, they just took over. So it was a takeover, actually. But, right. But it turned out, when the smoke cleared, see, you have to understand the name of Art Collins in radio was legend. Now, in the amateur radio world, the 75A1 was the showpiece, right, of Collins engineering. But what most people don't know, every aircraft depends on Collins radios. The Collins name is legend within the aviation industry as being super engineered. In fact, that's one of the reasons the company was in trouble, because they over-engineered everything. It was super, super, super reliable. And there was another piece of the story. The question that I was put to by Rockwell was, if you had the C system, what would you do with it? And I told him, well, it's an over-engineered communications package. They use it for, there's a trend coming for service bureaus. Third-party management of communications. There's a market for super engineered. The question they asked me wasn't, was it good or bad? They asked me, what would you do if you had it? And I told them, I gave them a good answer for it.
Right.
And interesting how they asked I answered the question they asked, what would you do if you had it? And I told them how they could apply it. See?
Right.
So, but it's funny that warmth between me and Art Collins, which was candid, just because I was a radio ham, and Art Collins, that was a milestone in my life to actually have met Art Collins. See? Yeah. And it was sincere. You know, it wasn't planned. It was just a candid reaction. But it clicked, and we clicked, and that all played out. But it was so funny how that little incident gets exaggerated by the time it gets back to Pittsburgh and El Segundo, the headquarters for Rockwell. The story was spread on the hallway. Oh, because a mutual friend of mine, my main sponsor within Rockwell. He played the story back to me. The way he heard it, that Chuck Missler saved the Collins acquisition. And I discovered when the smoke cleared, Rockwell was able to acquire the Art Collins, the greatest name in radio branding, for less than the tax loss carry forward. It was an incredible deal.
Yeah.
And the way they handled it was like a ballet, because they did what they asked, but they knew it wasn't going to be quite enough, and then that changed the terms, you see.
Right.
And I used to kid Wally Booth. That was my guy. Wally Booth was my old friend from my Ford Motor Company earlier days, and I almost followed him around when he went different places. He'd always use me as his consultant. He took over United Brands. And that's another whole story. But it's all who you know, and those kinds of things. And
but part of the beauty of this story is you were in a meeting that had nothing to do with the Collins acquisition by Rockwell.
No. It just happened to. But the story had gotten twisted, adverse to me, that got punctured by the fact that I was a radio ham. I was not a computer guy. I was a communications guy.
Yeah.
That put me in a different category mindset, during an era when that was polarized. People were computer people and communication. They didn't talk to one another.
Right.
And in fact, there's a joke that used to go around, that it's who's the worst of all, the computer and communication guy? And the answer is it's a tie. It's just there was always sort of like a war going on.
Yeah,
that all got dissolved later, of course, but it was in that era that I was tagged by Art Collins immediately as I was a radio ham, not a computer guy, a radio ham. And that preceded all that stuff.
And that melted his heart. And
we just were, I was suddenly, I remember walking down the hall, and he had his arm on my shoulder. He's a tall guy,
Yeah.
And
a true Texan.
Yeah. And a walking legend. The Collins radio is to this day. You can't go on an aircraft without being dependent on Collins engineering.
Yeah.
And
now you've had a number of those instances where, totally unbeknownst to you, unplanned by you, you had a door that was opened, and you just were bold enough to step through.
Yep.
To say yes.
Yes.
And it's kind of changed directions of your life, but also changed, in that case, a major business deal.
Oh yeah, there was an incident in the Air Force, I remember. In the Air Force, like the Navy, you stand watch. In the Air Force, you get assigned to be the base commander from after 5 for 24 hours as like a watch thing. And I was assigned to that. And while I was on duty, and you're with the air police then when something happens, call came in from the officers' country of an attempted suicide. So I jump in the AP with the MPs, APs they call it,
air police,
over to the war houses. As we get there, at the base of this 2-story studio thing, there's a guy smoking a cigarette. And as we go in upstairs, there is a hallway. There's a bathroom to the left with a woman sitting on the john, not just sitting there, with her hands in the pool. She'd slit her wrists, blood flowing over the wash basin. Across the hall watching are her 2 kids while she's trying to commit suicide. Her husband's down in the basement having a cigarette. And I see all this. I rip off my tie and put a tourniquet on to try to stop the bleeding, and she's fighting with me. It's none of your business. What right do you have to interfere, and so forth. And finally, the APs catch up with me, and they take over. And so as we're going downstairs, I'm trying to recover from all this. And the APs get ready to go back to the base. I said, no, we're not going to go back to the base. I want to go back to the headquarters and find out why did it take them 19 minutes to get there because we were not first on the list. In other words, they took 19 more minutes to get there. We were there first, but why take them 19 minutes? We go back there, and there's just the night lights on, and I go in there, and there's a clerk on duty, and I want to understand why there was that 19-minute delay. So we go through the procedures, and I discover that if there's a woman involved, there has to be a WAF attendant. And she's not on standby, so they have to wake up someone to be with her. And they can't go better. They can't go faster than this base speed limit, which is 15 miles an hour. At Lowry Air Force Base, you go around the runway. The whole thing is. So we go back to write up my report. So I'm in this mood. And apparently in those days, I was also on a vocabulary kick. I used to collect words that I hadn't seen. And I apparently used the term egregious. I happened to use that term. I found out later everybody went to the dictionary, so not characterized by competence is what I mean. But anyway, I wrote up the several-page report and turned it in. And the next morning, when I'm off duty now, sitting back with my top civilian was a law student. He says, Chuck, you ought to tell the colonel. I told him what happened, by the way, when I was on duty. I gave him the whole story. And he said, you better tell the colonel what happened. Well, good idea. So I reported to Colonel Scholes. So it's a good thing I did, because later that morning I get a call from the general in charge of the hospital. And he's mad. He says, you get over here. I says, no, if you want me to get over there, you tell my boss, which is Colonel Scholes. And so I stiffed him. I didn't answer. Well, I found out, apparently, that everybody on the base, because they all had their story about the hospital, the base hospital, and the general in charge, and the fact that his clock got set made me the hero. So everybody's buzzing about this, And I got to thinking about that. If I wasn't career. In fact, I told the colonel, as soon as my time's up, I'm going to get out of the service. That's my plan. But I leveled with him so he knew where I stood. And but I thought about that a lot. If I had been career, I wouldn't have the guts to do that. But because I did it, big score.
Yeah.
And I thought the irony is interesting. I didn't care because I didn't care, but how inverse that is. If I had been career, I would have tiptoed probably and not had the guts to do any of that stuff.
Didn't want to jeopardize the future.
And that pattern, I thought often, is so frequent that we don't step out because we tiptoe. A big mistake. I look back at my life so often. I saw opportunities.
Yeah.
You just step in and see what they lead to, But anyway, yeah, the Collins Act. I used to always joke about that when they talked about the incredible acquisition of Collins Radio by Rockwell because of an incident in a hallway.
Well, I guess part of my love of that particular story is just that. It's an incident in a hallway. In God's economy, He had a plan for your life, and it
wasn't a scheme.
that.
It was just a candid response.
Yeah.
It did play on a background because I got a very early radio ham ticket when I was a kid. That was dear to me. It still is. W60HD. I should look at my paper and make sure I keep that current.
Yeah.
And
well, what people probably don't know is on your desk you still have a transmitter.
Oh yeah.
It's not hooked up, but you've got it there.
Yep. That was in my impressionable teens. That was a big part of my, hobbies. I've always had technical hobbies, I guess.
Doesn't seem that long ago, but it probably is over 10 years or something when you started freshening up your Morris again.
Yes, just had the itch to do that. Yep.
Most people now don't even know what Morse code is. Interesting, thinking about previous to that time, what you were with Ford Motor Company, and that was an interesting time when the twin I-beam came out, when the Mustang was introduced to the
Yep.
world, when you actually created, as it were, the first intranet that led to
Yep,
much
yep.
of what we have today in the world globally.
Yep.
People don't know,
Yes,
and
funny
you don't remember those
Funny stories about that too, yeah?
Yeah, tell us about it.
Well, I'm just mulling that over because how was that? I was in my office. The Russians were visiting University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and they wanted to come over. And for some reason, we were in the Fortune magazine. Can't quite fit all the pieces together in my mind. But the interesting thing is I got a call from Bert Herzog, who's a predecessor of mine in University of Michigan, called me if the Russians are visiting, if they would mind coming over to Ford to see our setup there. And because it had been alluded to, I think, in Fortune magazine, something. Sure, come on, send them over. So they came over, and I showed them around and so forth. The strange thing that occurred is I think it was the CIA. Every place the Russians went, they had interpreters, but with me, they didn't. They came over and spoke English. And at first there was disbelief by the CIA guys because they didn't know they spoke English, but they just let their hair down and we chatted. And they asked me a strange question. Oh, one of the things we had that we took advantage of was a Philco computer. Now Ford took Philco out of the computer business, but we happened to have a few in inventory that were incredibly powerful machines and took advantage of those. So I had a Philco 212. 211, 212 were the final model numbers. And while the Russians were visiting, they asked me a strange question. They asked me if we had IPL5 implemented on our Philcos. Well, first of all, there's probably not one computer programmer, 100, that even knows that IPL5, it was a programming language that was unique, had advantages, but did we have it on our Philco? It was a strange question because most people don't even know that language exists. They were obviously briefed. Because the only reason I knew anything about it, because I previously had been with System Development Corporation in Santa Monica, and I had some background with that. So I was able to, but I picked up on that. That's a strange question. And when I mentioned that to the later CIA follow-up meeting, they were all stressed by that because that implied that they had been briefed for the visit. It wasn't spontaneous.
As it appeared to be, yeah.
But while they were there, I kidded them. I said, if they in Russia can get their hands on a Model 35 teletype, they could dial us up and use our computer as just a demonstration. And it turned out that they had only one level of approval that they would need to get to do that. And my own boss in there, McDonald, thought it would be an interesting test to measure the two bureaucracies to see if we could get clearance as quickly as they could.
Just as something fun to do. Huh?
Oh yeah, exactly. And that just launched a whole bunch of stupid questions by people coming through, asking questions, worried that somehow it was going to compromise. It's just silly question.
Because they didn't understand the technology at all.
And the thing that made it possible wasn't communications, it was the fact that our files were on a disk. I happened to be able to get my hands on the original Bryant disk drives. These were mounted in the basement of the building. They were 28 head disk drives. But because I had the files online is why that would all work. It had nothing to do with communication. It had to do with disk drive technology. Right. Anyway, those are strange days because of the overreaction of people who had just a little knowledge. And
were you ever able to get the clearance so that you made the connection, or do you recall that?
I don't remember. I frankly don't remember. I think we finally had a little demo just as a public relations time. Didn't amount to anything. But the people that came out of the woodwork were asking dumb questions that somehow were paranoid about the whole thing was crazy. Those are strange days. It was in the earlier, it's always in the early stages of a technology, it's always opportunity,
Yeah. Well, later stage, you're talking about disk drives at their birth, really.
Yeah.
Almost prototype stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Compared to today, certainly.
And Western Digital got into that later. When I took over Western Digital, it was just an LSI, integrated circuit house, if you will.
Well, I was going to go there because you changed the way that, you changed disk drives forever when you were there. Tell us about that
Well,
one.
what we did, we redefined the whole semiconductor market. In those days, you had commodities and custom. Commodities were like memories, whose livelihood depended on cost. In other words, the cheapest one.
Right.
Our costs at Western Digital were about 2 to 1 out of bed. In other words, they cost us $5 to when they should have cost us $2 to make the integrated circuits, because we were out of date, we had an out-of-date plant. But I discovered that we were able to sell certain designs because we knew disk controllers. And so we could sell these things for $20. They cost us they cost us $5 to make. They should have cost us $2, but we sold them for $20, so there's margin in it. Well, as I looked at that, I realized that we were a publisher, and we happened to have a printing press that was out of technology, but it didn't matter because our margin was in the manuscript, not in the. You follow me?
Yep.
I had
you just saw it totally in a new and fresh way.
So we invented in those days, if you went to custom stuff, that was a high-risk kind of thing to do, strangely. It doesn't sound risky because you've got customers, but the trouble is by the time it took you 18 months to engineer a large-scale integrated circuit, by then your customer may not be around or may not have the production he planned. It turned out, strangely enough, custom was high risk, strangely enough. Commodity was all cost-driven in terms of memories, so you really had just two parts. Well, there was a middle market that we invented, which later called it application-specific. We had circuits that we could design that were not custom. They were for a class of customer that you could predict. And so we designed chips to fit that market, and it would carry margin. Even though our costs were out of bed, we still had enough margin to win playing that game.
Right.
And so we invented a third segment of the market called the application-specific integrated circuit, and that revolutionized the whole integrated circuit world, if you will. And so that was because we approached it as a publishing model, not as a manufacturing model kind of thing. And I guess I got that insight because I previously had been involved in some book publishing projects, and I saw the parallel. So I saw what we really had here was our margin was in the manuscripts, not in the printing press.
Yeah.
And the fact that we were saddled with a out-of-technology printing press didn't hurt us because we had enough uniqueness in our manuscript. And so that worked, and that led to a whole. It later led, because we had uncollectible receivable, we got actually in the disk drive business. Western Digital later really becomes a drive supplier, but that came later.
Right.
And
but really, it seems to me,
well, the Western Digital story also, though, led to another family of things, because when a company gets in trouble, the banks usually have consultants they bring in that will restructure the balance sheet and restructure the most banks don't want to own anything for a lot of it because they get in lawsuits. So they get uncomfortable when they have control. But they have consultants they bring in that will restructure the balance sheet to turn the thing around, and the banks will quarterback that. Well, the problem is when you have a high technology company, that formula doesn't work because a high technology company doesn't have a balance sheet. The assets go home at 5 o'clock, the people, or there are technologies that are being misapplied. And so you can't solve the problem from the balance sheet. You've got to solve the problem from the earnings statement, okay? And it happened, Western Digital was, I don't think it was the first one, but the point was I talked the bank into allowing me to try an earnout. And Dick Starr at First Interstate Bank rolled with it. He says, we joked about it. He says, you take the balance sheet, I'll take the operating statement, we'll earn this thing out. Okay, we'll give it a try. And we did. So we earned our way out. But that turned out to be the magic formula because I had a series of those occur where they had a company that had technology, but it was being misapplied. By applying it differently, you could make a loser into a winner. But the point was you're doing it by earning it out, not by trying to restructure the balance sheet.
Right.
And so the standard formulas didn't work. So I used to joke, I said, it's a case where in the land of the blind, a one-eyed man is a king. Because we had enough of an insight to get it criticize. And I used to joke, if you do 2 or 3 of those in a row, they think you did it on purpose. And so we had for a while there, we had a thing going because when banks had a high technology company in trouble, they'd think of me.
Right.
Because they knew, first of all, they as a bank would come out all right.
Which is really bottom line concern.
Yeah, many people do the other thing. They know the bank's trapped, so they take advantage of the bank. I did it the other way around. I saw to it that the bank won because that's where I was going to get my next deal.
Right.
And so I did a series of those for a while. I was known as a high technology turnaround specialist in a time when most people didn't know. Most people in the technology world, they hear Chapter 11, they go paranoid. Well, a Chapter 11 is one of the most powerful corporate development tools around. There's only 2 times that a company is clean, when it's first formed or when it comes out of an 11. And so if you know how to use a Chapter 11, it's a very powerful tool for reconstruction.
Right.
And since I've done a couple of those, and most technology people wouldn't touch them because they sound like leprosy, I was able to make a little career of that for a few years. And again, it's a place that's willing to go where other people don't, you know.
Yeah.
And you know.
You know, you think about Western Digital, you had some powerful sales or regional oversight incentive programs for those 5 guys. Tell us about that.
Probably which one you mean?
I think you had 5 regions, the U.S. broken up into 5 regions, and if they made quota, you had a very special
my
incentive.
I have always believed in outrageous but self-financing incentives, and I remember a rival guy had told his people that if they such and such, they'd get a chance at a drawing for, $1,000 a month for 20 years, kind of thing. And I thought that's no good. Let's do it the other way around. And I indicated I had, I think, 5 key. The United States is divided into 5 regions, each with a vice president of the region. And I told each of them, I gave them a letter signed by the chief executive officer, approved by the board. I'll explain how I got that done. So if they deliver $1 million profit ahead of budget, they get $1,000 a month for 20 years. And that, whoa, that sounded exciting. The net present value is still only $90,000. It's not that big a deal as it sounds like at first, because it's out there. But I talked to the board. If someone turns in $1 million profit, will you give them a $1,000 a month raise? Of course, So the board approved it. So I had CEO approved letter, gave to each of the 5, and Bob Davis, the guy in Northeast, he did win and he got that. But that made history, because everybody's the calculation has $250,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, not exactly, because it's a net present value issue. So most people don't know how they work, net present value. But anyway, I've always enjoyed having really outrageous incentive programs.
Ferraris.
Yeah, I did a Ferrari the following year. I didn't have nearly this $1,000 a month for 20 years.
Yeah. It's interesting, I forgot the Russian connection with the tour at the Ford Motor Company thing.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that too. It just came back.
But that's a key issue, because you fast forward 40 years.
In fact, there's the other part of the story. Bert Herzog was in charge of computer graphics at Ford, and he quit because he got frustrated trying to sell them on taking computer graphics seriously. So he quit his job, became the guru for University of Michigan's computer department.
So that's how he ended up over
in
there.
In Ann Arbor,
Yep.
an hour away. And I took because when he left, I stepped into his shoes. And within 6 months, I got Ford to approve the computer graphics project. And I remember he was stunned, because he spent several years trying to sell that and couldn't get him to sell it. And I happened to take over his job, and within 6 months I got it approved. And what I did was, I found an application where I found out there were grade 8 engineers following direction cosigns to get continuities of scanned clays. Anyway, I found an application, that one application with graphics could be solved very quickly. So that wasn't the reason I wanted, but it was a reason that paid for the whole project. In other words, I found one application that economically justified the project, which is a different approach, you follow me?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Became a
and in
no-cost
fact,
item.
before I left Ford, I remember giving my boss a study of, I think, something like 14 different projects that I had gotten approved over the several years I was there. And I pointed out to him every one of them was approved on a basis that was separate from the real reason you wanted it. I used to think that was sort of profound. He wasn't surprised at all. In other words, that's just life.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between justifying it and the real reason you want it.
Right.
You want to find a way to justify it in order to economically justify it, but the real reason you want it is for a whole nother wave of growth.
Yeah.
Anyway, it go back to a lot of...
Oh, you forget more than most people ever knew. So.
The Lord gave me a life where I seemed to be in the right place at the right time. I just happened to be at the right place when something was happening, and I jumped in.
A hallway in Collins building, a desk or somewhere where you get a call from Michigan with some Russians.
The lesson, I think, is just to reach and go.
Yeah.
To jump in, put your toe in the water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
and to be suspicious of guarantees.
Yeah.
Go where the payoff is. And
well, when we overlay your history with your hobby, the Bible is your hobby, and then teaching, that same fearlessness we've been talking about a little bit over the last few days, the fear of man is a snare, Proverbs 29:25 tells us. And you've never had that fear. You didn't fear the general. Now, maybe because you weren't going to be career, but
sure.
that's really what, you weren't afraid of Art Collins. You spoke, you just spoke out. You weren't afraid to do the seventh day teaching. I'm just transitioning into the Bible side of things here. You weren't afraid to do the Antichrist and alternative ending, or whatever the title is. And that same boldness to go through the open doors or follow the leading of the Lord, or however you want to put it, has served all of us who are beneficiaries of that boldness as the Lord leads you in the Bible study side of things, to be able to look at things that others were, where they were afraid to go, as far as Bible teachers go. So really...
Well, same thing, I guess, yeah, same thing in business, you know, to not be a slave to a salary, but to step out and...
Innovate.
Innovate, yeah, and
There was, I'm not sure if it was Resdell or one of those acquisitions, turnaround things that you got, that really, really good deal where you ended up getting it for nothing, basically.
Oh, Resdell Industries.
I was pretty sure it was Resdell.
Resdell Industries had gotten into trouble, so First Interstate Bank happened to be holding, controlling in stock, but they were in trouble again somehow. That's when I found out about it. And I went to them and said, I will step in if you will sell me your stock. You've got 51%. If you will sell me that stock, and I offered them 50 grand on a non-recourse note. Not real cash, a note with non-recourse. And they thought I was kidding. They looked at me and laughed. I'll buy your 50. I'll own 51% of your stock for a 50 grand non-recourse note. And they looked at me. They thought I was being facetious.
Yep.
And I says, why would we do that? Because you know that if I'm in control, I'll get that thing turned around. The bank will come out whole, you'll be whole, and we'll go on with this thing. But I'll do it if I have control. I'm not going to touch it unless I have control. And I'm not going to put in cash. I don't need to put in cash. I'll put a non-recourse note in. And they went for it. There was a guy in charge of Resdell Industries, Stan Weisberg, I think his name was, one of these veteran government contract kind of characters.
Yep.
When he found out that I had bought 51% of the stock, he came unglued because he felt he could have raised more money than 50 grand. He didn't understand that wasn't the point, you see.
Yeah.
And it was, in fact, he even tried a takeover in a board meeting, not realizing I'm sitting on 51% of the stock. I can
veto anything you want.
I can dismiss the board if I want.
Yeah.
And he hadn't done his he didn't really think it through or do his homework. It was a very embarrassing meeting for him. But we took it over, and we and we bid a contract with I think it was Lockheed on the upgrade of the Sonobuoy thing. But we bid a big contract and won, and well, that brings back a bunch of strange memories. But anyway, it was just a gutsy play, and we earned it out.
But it essentially cost you in real
well,
dollars.
I ended up selling the thing because of cash flow. There's a procedure when you have an engineering change request, you've got to accommodate it. There's a way to recover the cost, but there's a cash flow problem. And I saw that coming, so I sold the whole thing. I picked up the phone and I sold it to PLC. It turned out there's a UK company that is acceptable to the Department of Defense.
Oh.
PLC, anyway, they bought it from me. It was literally all like a phone call and an overnight kind of thing. I sold the company to PLC because I couldn't stand the cash flow.
Right.
So I got out from under before it collapsed around my ears. But those were strange days.
You enjoyed the game.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
It wasn't about making money. It was about
playing the game.
Playing the game.
Yep.
And being able to exercise that creativity and that innovative kind of boldness that.
It was fun, yeah, exactly. It's a great game, and
But you have changed the way business is done. You've changed the way that you created a whole new realm for in the high-tech industry there with Western Digital by identifying a.
There were segments that had its victories. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, there was the odd failure. Computers to Soviet Union schools, for instance. The Russians back here and the Russians up there.
That was my big mistake.
Bookends.
That was my big mistake. I signed a joint venture. It wasn't a contract. It was a joint venture with the Soviet Union to provide 143,000 computers to 143,000 schools, and that what started to collapse that still would have been all right, except I tried to prop it up myself, which was aggressive and stupid, and I got what I deserved. And it was Hal Lindsey at that time that really kicked me in the butt. He took me aside and he says, "What do you like doing more than anything else?" And he knew what the answer was: Bible studies. Has it ever occurred to you to make that your profession? Never thought of that. I just did that. That was fun. That was my hobby,
And you'd been doing it for decades by then.
He said, I want you to make your hobby your profession. Switch it around. Never thought of doing that. But we both knew, because the Firefighters for Christ had 7 million tapes of mine flowing around. He says, normally you can't make it as an independent, but you've got enough of a following. You could do what you like doing best, and you can't get rich, but you could survive and do what you like doing. Tried to give it a try, and
it's worked out pretty well, not just for you, but for all of us who are beneficiaries of that change.
Yeah, that's when I really, that was fun. I was doing what I.
Hal was a good friend. I mean, still would be considered one of your
Your
lifetime
and as I was
friends.
getting my start, he was right there to help me. Gave me his platform, and he was there to be a loyal friend. Yep.
Well, you'd been staying in his home weekly after the weekly Bible studies at Calvary Costa Mesa anyway, right?
Yeah, I had a routine where I would come down from the hill, from Big Bear, and I had a Tuesday morning or something at Marie Callender's little Bible study. But anyway, I had a routine where I would spend the night with him, that overnight.
You did that for a long time, didn't you? Or a significant time.
Brings back some strange memories. I had a routine where I'd spend that one night, I'd spend the night there with them in their home, because they had some extra bedrooms.
Yep.
And there was one night, he called me and said, "We're not going to use that bedroom, we'll use a different bedroom." And fine. And as he was telling me that, Jan came by. No, what was her name? Anyway. "You're not going to tell him, are you?" And he was kind of embarrassed. "What are you not going to tell me?" "Well, the room we want you to use, no one's survived it before." "What?" "When his daughters stay, they won't stay in that room. There's a room there that they wanted me to use that they don't normally use." And he wasn't going to tell me. He wanted to just do an experiment if I'd notice anything. And we prayed. I used it, nothing happened. But then he shared with me that he used it one night and found himself floating off the floor. And there's something spooky about that room. They had seances in there or something.
Yeah.
I forgot that it had a history, apparently. In the family, they stayed away from that weird room. And he wanted to just see, there was a reason they had to shift it around, but.
Well, we could shift gears here and talk about how real the spirit realm is in actuality.
Yes.
A lot of people just don't understand how malevolent our enemy is and how real that realm is in the cosmic war that's been joined since Genesis 3.
That's what was so interesting about the thing, because everybody involved was sophisticated in that regard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes me think of Newport and you and Walter Martin and Walter's education in the spirit realm one night. You remember that one?
No, I have to think about it.
Somebody, I think you were together anyway, and somebody said that there was a problem with someone in a spiritual sense, and Walter didn't believe in that kind of stuff. So, but you went. Do you remember that? And he got educated.
It's coming back to me. I've forgotten.
We'll talk about it later after when you memorize. Yeah, just the whole thing with the room at Hal's house. Knowing that story, it made me think of the Walter incident. Seems like it was after Melodyland or something, but I can't remember either quite.
Yeah, I can't quite put the pieces together.
And just so anybody watching knows, this is just the way we talk when we're together at the kitchen table. So we just include you in it and talking to the people now that, you know, this is just what we enjoy doing, talking about the past, thinking about the power of God in our lives and how He's guided and led and directed and blessed and kept, and you know, it's all Him. But
yeah, Walter was a special one. He was a special one, Walter Martin. Walter Martin and Hal Lindsey and Chuck Smith, those were the big three in those days.
Yep.
Yep.
You were in there.
That was an era, interesting era.
When you think about that era, actually, that, you know, I don't know if you'd go a 20-mile radius or maybe out a little more, and you think about walking into a Christian bookstore and how many commentaries, how many of the most popular books of an era, not the day or a limited time frame, came from those men in
Yes.
that one small location, you know, as you consider the globe.
Yep, yep.
God just did something special there.
Very so, very much so.
Well, have we waffled long enough?
Probably so, probably so. Just funny how those eras come and go.
Yeah. And how God brings people together, you know, in the neighborhood to work together or to bring Him glory, even if it's only kind of together. He just choreographs and orchestrates. And Southern California, it's kind of like Capernaum, has no excuse. They have been so blessed in,
very
you know,
much so.
we were for decades with the richness of what God did through some of the guys there.
Very special days. Funny how one memory reminds you of another. They sort of, funny how they thread together a little bit.
What are you thinking?
I just can't quite put the pieces together.
Oh, it'll come.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going back 40, 30, 20 years.
Too many.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll just say thank you for joining us as we sit here and reminisce and talk about some of those opportunities that Chuck stepped into where he changed an industry or an architecture of some high-tech things, saved a company, be it Western Digital, Resdol, and there's many others or several other stories. And you know, so often we appreciate his Bible study, and that's the focus. Don't ever get it wrong. Number one in his life is Jesus Christ. But Jesus has allowed him this colorful life and used him just in amazing ways. He doesn't even remember many of them. So when we sit like this, we try to get back to the memories and you know, enjoy them again. And so thank you for joining us in that little walk down memory lane that we call the tenses of life. And God bless you.
Don Beal or one of the guys came to me as Chuck Missler because Art Collins is upset you're on this team. And I'm bewildered that he would know me from Adam. I didn't know I was coming. Why would he be concerned, upset that he found out that I was going to be on this review team? And I'm trying to integrate this because it's all one surprise after another. And but there was an interesting thing occurred right after that. I was going around down the hallway around the turn, and lunch had been brought in, as they often do there, during just a sandwich lunch brought in. And as they're sitting there, Art Collins is sitting, and I'm being introduced to him for the first time. And I just had this warning, of course, but there's Art Collins, and the big, tall guy. And I told him, it was a strange impulse of candor. As he stood up, I took his hand, and it says, Art Collins, this is an event in my life, because I said, I'm a radio ham, W6 Old Hound Dog, and I've lived under the spell of the 75A1 receiver, which is in those days, it was the dream of any amateur radio guy. That was the cream of the crop.
The Rolls Royce. Or
yeah,
whatever. Right.
And so I haven't mentioned the fact that I mentioned I was a radio ham melted him, and we ended up. See, suddenly, what happened in that instant? You have to understand the culture in those days. The technology culture was divided into two groups: computer people, communications people, and they didn't. It was an era when they were at odds with each other. Apparently, the background I didn't have then, I found out later, is apparently TRW came in to look at Art Collins, and they brought in their computer consultant, which was an IBM-oriented kind of guy. And one of the pet projects of Art Collins was what he called the C system. It was a very over-engineered, super system that was his pride and joy. And the TRW consultant, he disparaged Art Collins' favorite project. Art Collins threw TRW out of the deal. And so when they heard that Rockwell had brought their computer consultant, they thought it would be a repeat of the same thing, you see.
So he was already, the deck was stacked against you from the beginning.
But when I came around the corner and I turned out to be a radio ham, suddenly that was just the opposite. Willie Six, anybody that knows amateur radio knows that W6 calls implies very early, because they ran out of W6 way back. If you know the amateur radio culture, a W6 OHD meant
Well, here we are once again with the tenses of life. Chuck Missler, Brian Hughes here, as we sit together, as we do so often, just to talk about Chuck's life and some of those remarkable events that really defined not only Chuck's life and all, but sometimes changed an industry.
Well, they have a lesson, because sometimes the most trivial incident in a large corporation has leverage that you'd never predict. It's just strange. There was an era there where I was very close to some of the Rockwell guy. Don Beal was the head of electronics group, and there was a planning meeting on I think a Thursday or Friday. I was part of just a planning meeting, and apparently Art Collins was Collins Radio was going to be into play, and so there was going to be a visit of a senior team to go visit Richardson, Texas, where in Dallas, roughly, it's a suburb of Dallas, which was the headquarters. That I had, see, I had a radio ham ticket when I was like 9, young, way, very young.
Yeah.
And so the fact that I was W60HD tagged me as a long-standing communications guy, not a computer guy. And so Art Collins was melted. We walked down the hall. He's a big, tall guy. He put his hand on my shoulder, and he's talking about his new digital tuning thing and stuff. Well, the way that gets carried back to headquarters, I found out later.
In California.
In California, is the story that got back to the headquarters was that Chuck Missler saved the Collins acquisition. Now, that whole thing got exaggerated out of proportion. And when I heard those stories, I couldn't understand, what are they talking about? And it was all an exaggeration of that moment, is that because Art Collins suddenly warmed up to us, suddenly he was among friends, and before the week was over, Art Collins and Don Beal flew to El Segundo, or was it Pittsburgh? Anyway, they had 2 headquarters, to pick up an $85 million check.
Which in those days was...
Big money, big money. And they knew that was not enough for Art Collins to turn around, and when he needed a penny more, they just took over. So it was a takeover, actually. But, right. But it turned out, when the smoke cleared, see, you have to understand the name of Art Collins in radio was led for Collins Radio. And anyway, in this planning meeting, as a surprise, the guy leading the meeting was Don Beal. He finished the meeting by letting me know you're going to be going with us to Dallas on the weekend. And I was surprised because I didn't know I was going. It was sort of just a gesture of let me tag along on this big deal. See, so okay, great. But the important part of the story was I didn't know. That was a surprise. I didn't know I was coming. It was a last-minute kind of bouquet, so to speak. And sure enough, we fly to Richardson, Texas, and a strange thing occurred as we got off the plane. The head of McKinsey and Company, which is the worldwide management consulting firm, as we're getting off the plane, the head of McKinsey was there. I forget his name now. It'll come to me in a minute. Pulled me aside. Says, "Chuck, how did you get on this plane?" And I didn't know I was going to be on the plane. He says, "I've been working on this thing for 2 years. And now that we're getting to the closing, how did you get involved here?" I was bewildered. I didn't know I was going to be involved, but he knew I was. He was surprised to see me there. So we get off the plane and we go into the organization. Everybody was assigned sort of a running mate to do a due diligence on Art Collins's company. And as we're going through one of the hallways,